Going live. It says we're on YouTube. I never know if the first few moments are on YouTube, but just to be safe. Hello, everybody. You are listening to Growing Down Podcast, and we are joined again by our good friend, Matt Segall. I am your co-host, Jeremy Johnson, and Ryan as well is going to be here. But Matt, the other Matt, is missing today. He had to be away from computer. So, Matt might tune in through the comments. But otherwise, it's just the three of us. And I think, Ryan, you wanted to give a little introduction maybe for Matt, or just sort of introduce some of the thoughts and questions or framing for today's conversation.
Yeah, sure. So, it's a pleasure to have you back on, Mr. Segall. And, Matt is a professor at CIIS in the philosophy department.
Yeah, we call it the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness Department, just to distinguish the unique and crazy work that we do.
Yes, and speaking of unique and crazy work, you've been on this Great American Road trip, multiple interpretations there. And, you were talking on the Stoa we were talking about, what's the future of America, and are we feeling pessimistic about the future, right? As the culture wars have really reached this fever pitch of complete divisiveness and polarization and tribalization. And you've been on this trip talking to everyday Americans, Trump supporters, making connections across the aisle. So just tell us a little bit about who you're talking to and any kind of salient insights or highlights from these conversations. Has it kind of restored your hope in America? Did it make you more pessimistic? Just what's it been like for you?
Well, yeah, it's been a trip, and I'm happy to say that there haven't been too many conflicts, and this isn't the first time I've driven across the United States and back. Both times leaving from California. First time I went all the way to Vermont and back, and this time we've gotten as far east as Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I am now. And I think it's appropriate, this trip metaphor, both to describe what I'm doing concretely, but also this moment of American apocalypse that we're all going through. I think many Native American authors and cultural critics have suggested that the United States began with apocalypse, which was, when the settler colonists arrived or invaded. They brought old world diseases, which literally decimated 90% of the Native American population was wiped out. And so this country for natives begins in apocalypse, but I think now more and more white people, descendants of colonists, are beginning to realize that the apocalypse has arrived, and that the American way of life, not only is it not or no longer non-negotiable, but it's being ripped from our hands and pulled out from beneath us, beneath our feet. So we're experiencing a kind of psychedelic apocalypse of our collective sense of identity, and we're going on this trip that so far feels pretty bad and demonic, a confrontation with the shadow. Trump is, I couldn't imagine a better personification of the American shadow, with all of our vices of being a money-loving, greedy, conceited, self-obsessed, egomaniacal people, right? Those are our bad sides that refuse to ever admit we've done anything wrong. We're always the best and the greatest and all of that. So we've gotten the president that we deserve in many respects. And on my literal journey across the United States, though, I've had occasion to stop over in some small towns along the way, and just had sort of serendipitous encounters with locals. And there was a sort of, we never engaged explicitly in a political exchange, but there was a sort of recognition that, I'm from California, I'm driving my electric car, and reading my book in a cafe. It's like, okay, these locals in a small town in the middle of Arizona, where was it, Gallup? No, it was Gallup, New Mexico was one of our first small town stops. And, the older gentleman I think one of them was Latino actually, and then two older white guys just kind of welcomed us to the town. And they were, one of them was a football coach, and the other guys were retired, I think. And we didn't explicitly talk politics, but I saw this like going out of their way to welcome me to their small community, to offer any assistance that we might need, and this real sense of welcoming, and I think an intentional desire to not fall into the stereotype. So that's kind of been what I've been experiencing, just these very human encounters at the grocery store, or at the cafe, or walking along the street. And it's been interesting to be doing a trip during a pandemic, because it makes I think even once this virus has subsided and the danger epidemiologically has subsided, we're still going to have anxiety when we're in public about getting too close to people, because like germs, right? I mean, it's heightened our awareness of the fact that we are more intimately bound together, that we share a single atmosphere. And I think that raises some anxieties, and it also challenges us to connect in new ways. But given all of these challenges that we're facing politically and in terms of the pandemic, I so far have been mostly delightfully surprised by these interactions. But I haven't been in the inner cities. I haven't been on the front lines of a lot of these rebellions and counter rebellions and whatnot that's unfolding across the United States, and has been for the last several months. And I expect that will continue to flare up as we move toward and beyond the election. So I don't want to be naive and say, well, if you actually get out there and just talk to people, everything's fine. I don't think that's necessarily true, but there is still the possibility for just simple human connection, I have found. So I'll take a little hope where I can get it, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, go ahead, Jamie.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the themes that I've been hearing a lot lately, especially in internet activist circles, is the desire or the yearning to come back down to earth and to get offline, to meet each other, and how much of these political, ideological tensions are stoked by social media, in just terms of our main form of communication being this hyperpolarizing medium. How much would that continue to exist or persist without it? Or what form would it take if we weren't all online? Obviously, that's not the reality, but it is an interesting experience to kind of do what you're doing right now in the midst of the pandemic, get offline, meet people face to face, even with our masks on, and to just sort of be in a place with other individuals who welcome you. I wish we had more of that right now. I think that's been profoundly missing, because of the unfortunate circumstances of being sheltered in place, et cetera, not being able to mediate some of these conversations beyond an already deeply polarized, street protest, or, something that's been organized online, et cetera. So just reflecting with you about that.
Yeah. And, for this crisis in the American polity to be occurring just as the Anthropocene is showing its face to us unmistakably, and the consequences of our ecological ignorance are, the chickens are coming home to roost. And it's like just when we need to protest and or gather in public spaces to have dialogue, we're faced with the pandemic, probably a result of the spillover effect of habitat loss and humans coming into contact with animals they normally wouldn't. And so we're faced with this virus that makes us even more antisocial than social media already were. And so it's a double challenge, and it's an example of the way that our political problems, our social dilemmas, can't be separated from the ecological situation. It's all part and parcel of the same Earth process, and so we're facing challenges on multiple fronts: natural and cultural and social.
Yeah, just a comment, something that comes to mind whenever I go out and speak to people. And I live in complete Trump country. I drive down the road. There's MAGA signs, Blue Lives Matter, American flags, Trump. But whenever I talk to people who, in real life, or in any kind of non-explicitly political context, even if they are, even if they hold views that are radically different from my own, they're still meeting in that kind of civic space. You remember that we have so much more in common than what's different, right? I mean, we both are trying to make it as human beings, with relationships, with families. We have jobs. We need to make it economically, and we all care about the same community that we live in. But with social media, we get sucked into this political hyper reality where the conversation only becomes about politics, and we only see each other as political abstractions or political entities, and we forget that there's this human part of us too, that there's probably, as American citizens living through this time together, that we probably have so much more in common, and we forget about that completely on social media, getting into all these divisive political arguments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, in so many ways, the political economy that we live within is systematically, and has been systematically, disabling us, in the sense that this political economy has made us less capable of seeing those commonalities, and it has emphasized the ways that we are in a competitive form of relationship with one another, rather than sharing a commonwealth, or feeling that as though we belong to or are participant members within a commonwealth. We feel as though we are just individuals competing in a marketplace, and that there's scarce resources and they're getting scarcer, and the immigrants are trying to come in and steal it. And, so we're all set in opposition to one another, and there's very little basis for collective feeling that isn't limited to some tribal form of identity, but that is truly pluralistic and democratic and inclusive. And so we're starved of that by design, by our economic system, which is in control of our political system. Capitalism, the American democracy, the American Republic represents corporate interests. It's obvious. And so, our biggest challenge right now is to overcome that systemic influence upon our lives, to reconnect as human beings, to recognize that we share an atmosphere, that we share an earth system, and an ecological network of energy, and there's no escape. As Bruno Latour says, there is no other planet for us to go to. We have to come down to earth and finally inhabit the place that we're, the common ground that we share. And I think one of the most important conversations we can have right now is to figure out how and where and when to convene in ways, and to assemble in ways in the midst of a pandemic that allow us to remember what we do share and the common interests that we do have, and put the political labels aside.
So how do we do that, Matt? Do you have any ideas? I know we part of our research was listening to your recent Stoa talk, and which was in part to kind of spiritual vision, constructive vision for the future of America. And I appreciated in that context the way in which the ideal, perhaps, of people who an equality and a justice for all, which has not been realized in its completeness in America, as a kind of human potential. And you talked a bit about how seeing, or the kind of spiritual strength of America in its individuality as something that we contribute to the international human family. So how do we work with what we've got, I guess is my question, towards rebuilding that social cohesion in our own way? Because I as you said, I don't know if it's going to be easy to just kind of go, let's build a collectivist oriented culture, start that way? Like, how do we start with where we are, right, with America's own kind of creative genius?
Yeah, well, I mean, Americans are generally terrified of collectivism and communism and socialism. And so I think there's a way of approaching the transformation that's necessary in a way that speaks to the best of America's values. And so I think we need to find a way of, we meaning the integral left, I guess, find a way of languaging this transformation that builds on the values of individuality and individual freedom, but also justice for all. And that looks at the language of our own founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution, and that really tries to hear again, as if for the first time, this declaration that this country is going to be founded and governed upon the ideals of freedom and justice for all, but also that based on the ideal that all men and women of every color and every gender and every sexual orientation have a right, an inalienable and self-evident right to life, liberty, and happiness. Those are bold ideals. And if we just look again at our own founding documents and sort of reaffirm them and reapply them to the present, and we got to fit the ecological in there too. As great as these founding documents are, they're great enough that like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. could still, in resistance to the dominant streams of American, racism and sexism, these African American leaders could still appeal to the values of the Constitution and the Bible and say, hey, white people, listen to your own highest cultural achievements. Not that the Bible is a product of white culture or European culture. It's not, obviously. It's a product of a Semitic culture in interaction with the Greeks, and neither of those cultures, I think, is white. But in any event, there's this inheritance of a tradition that Europeans and the founders of the United States held to be sacred, and from the very first day that this nation was founded, failed to live up to those sacred ideals. And so maybe rather than resisting the values America claims to be founded on, we could really re-emphasize those values and look again at how we have always failed to adequately apply and perform and realize them.
I wonder if this would be a good chance to segue into what I really wanted to talk to you today, given your expertise and background understanding Romanticism and German philosophy, German idealism, and so forth. And on your Stoa talk, you said something that to me was very interesting because I never thought about it this way. I think you were referring to like white supremacist or other kind of like racist or race realist ideologies, and how they're actually deeply like materialist in nature, right? It's a kind of gross materialism that manifests as a kind of social racism, but the materialism, that kind of toxic materialism, which may be part of the shadow of the American lineage, as you were alluding to, kind of contributes to that. And the way that I've been interpreting all of these movements, because I have a tremendous interest in like neo-fascism, I have an interest in just the history of fascism and what Alexander Dugin is doing and saying, and some of the new national populist movements and strongman kind of cult of personalities that have been cropping up all over the West. And to me, there's a common thread that runs through all of them. And when I talk to people who are part of these groups, this same theme always comes up. It's some form of essentialism, right? It's some form of longing for, I want to cling to some kind of essential ideal where I can derive a relatively stable sense of identity and purpose and value in such a rapidly changing, deracinated, modernized world with this global capitalist economic system and a postmodern culture, post-truth or kind of almost nihilistic world. and that longing for this, it to me it does seem, and I want to get your opinion on, see if I'm kind of thinking about this in the right way. It has a very romantic kind of feeling to it, right? There's a romantic longing for a return to some kind of pristine, pure world of unchangingness, to fortify myself or root myself against such a rapidly changing world. And I'm just curious, like, like, do you see a connection between Romanticism, nationalism, and fascism? Do you think that's kind of an unfair characterization or an unfair label on Romanticism? I'm just interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is unfair. I think there's a lot that is of value in the Romantic tradition in Germany and in England and in America. But it's, so what Romanticism in general shares with, say, Nazi fascism is a rejection of modernity, at least a rejection of a certain techno-scientific, individualist, more or less Enlightenment conception of modernity. I mean, Romanticism is itself a product of modernity. So modernity is in many ways, in its full complexity, it's the tension between the Enlightenment and the Romantic reaction. Because the values that the Enlightenment upholds, that of rationalization and technologization and the individual will and freedom unmoored from any sort of communal or ecological bounds. That's what Romanticism reacts against and says, well, wait a minute, we can't just throw out all this traditional stuff. But Romanticism is not just a return to traditionalism. There's a Prometheanism. There's a longing to progress and to explore new vistas and horizons within Romanticism as well. There's a conflict between like classical Greek poetry and the German Romantics, like the Schlegel brothers and Novalis and others. They're like, yes, they're inheriting classical Greek poetry, but they want to do something different. So it's not just about a conservation of what was achieved in the past and a longing for this eternal stability of some foregone utopia. Romanticism in a figure like Friedrich Schelling is a sense of one of the earliest, I would say, integral understandings of the way in which the natural world, the physical universe is in some way entangled and bound up with the evolution of consciousness or the inner world, and that these are not two separate domains as like Descartes had imagined, more of a Enlightenment type thinker, though of course he reserved room in the interior domains of the human soul for religion to have a role. But in someone like Schelling, you start to get a sense that, hey, human beings were not parachuted in to nature from heaven and constructed by God to serve some providential purpose that separates us from the rest of the natural world. Schelling's romantic understanding of the human-earth relationship, I think, is one that still has a lot to teach us. And yes, it's critical of many of these modern Enlightenment exaggerations, but that doesn't mean that it is necessarily fascist. I mean, I certainly would hope not. And the thing is, you brought up Alexander Dugin. A lot of his critiques of liberalism and a lot of these more romantic philosophical stances, like whether it's Heidegger or Schelling, the critiques of liberalism and this individualism that goes beyond just valuing individual experience into thinking that there is no society, there are only individuals. The Dugin or the Duginian or the Heideggerian critique of liberalism, I think, is valid. And we have to deal with those critiques and respond with our own alternative vision for humanity, rather than pretend like, oh, they should just be banned and deplatformed and the proper response to philosophical fascism is not to is not to shout over them, but to out-philosophize them. And so I, for one, am glad that Dugin, I should say, I would prefer that Dugin not be banned from all of the California tech company platforms. I think he should be able to engage in public debate, because after all, what is liberalism if it's not defending the value of open rational discourse? And I might disagree with Dugin, but he's clearly done his homework and he's familiar with the tradition of philosophy, not just in the West. And I think we need to engage in public dialogue and debate, rather than just trying to deplatform, because that makes liberalism look like the kind of caricature that he's trying to paint it as. And for socialists, because Dugin will talk about the three different political theories of the modern period as liberalism, fascism, and socialism or communism. For socialists, I think we also, I say we because I do tend to lean in that direction, but I also have these romantic tendencies, which many socialists would say kind of smells like fascism. And when I engage with folks who support Dugin, or these third positionists like Keith Woods on YouTube, it's a variety of white nationalism, I get accused of being a liberal by those folks, and they think socialism is just sort of a slightly more economically progressive form of liberalism. So just like we tend to collapse Dugin into fascism, which he says he's not, Dugin and his folks tend to collapse we socialists into liberals, because we're caricaturing each other. And so I think this is a dialogue that needs to happen. It's frightening. I won't deny that. One of the things that makes me hesitant to just directly engage and have an open debate with these folks is that I don't necessarily trust them, and I don't want them to win a debate. In terms of, I use air quotes because there's always perception, which is different than truth. And if I happen to be having a bad day and don't articulate myself clearly enough, and then Dugin is perceived to have won a debate, I mean, shit, I would regret doing it. But
Dugin destroys a CIIS professor.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it needs to be well moderated, but I still think this is the challenge we're faced with, and we can't run from it.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. So here's my $1 million follow-up question, right? Is that, as you said, Dugin, some tenets of fascism. I've been talking to the QAnon guys, right? There is a lot I can relate to, in that one of the things that really has them aggrieved is this such a cold and harsh spiritual disenchantment and desouling of the world through modernity, right? And the alienation and anomie that generates, it's so that has such a devastating effect. It cuts so deeply into the psyche that this kind of longing for a more collectivist, very religious, pure spiritual essentialized world is so strong that the critique of modernity is there, but then it picks up too many unhealthy elements of that's a slippery slope towards fascism, right? So how do we, by understanding their genuine needs and soul's yearning, right? How do we jiu-jitsu that movement towards a healthier alternative affirmative vision? And then, I'd love to get Jeremy's thoughts in here too. Like, what is that, as people who understand integral theory, consciousness studies, philosophy, what does that look like, right? How can we can say, okay, we understand why you guys are so pissed off at modernity and how alienating and disenchanting that is. Here's a healthier alternative where we get the things that you're going for. We address those needs and satiate your desires, and get rid of the fascist kind of leanings, right? Like, have you thought about what that looks like and how to kind of shift the conversation in that way?
Well, I see some convergences happening. I mean, first of all, I want to just express some humility and say that, like, I don't think culture can be engineered. I don't think that we're in charge really of how history unfolds. We participate, but not from a position of absolute knowledge and in possession of the right way to solve the problem. I mean, we just don't know. that, you know, this isn't to say that I don't have and that we shouldn't have certain ethical convictions that guide our political activity because we hope to bring about certain ends, but we need to, I think, act with some humility and some openness to our assumptions about how to achieve the ends that we seek, that they might be wrong. There might be other ways to achieve those ends, and that people we thought we disagreed with about the ends may have actually the means to help us achieve our own ends. And that also we have to be humble culturally enough to even be willing to recognize that our ends may be outdone by the ends sought by others, that we hadn't considered an end, you know, a moral virtue that actually out-contextualizes the virtues that we were seeking. And so there's a need for that kind of humility and openness. That said, how do we acknowledge the identity crisis that we're in as human beings, and at the same time check the reaction that emerges to try to clutch after some, you know, adolescent male fantasy of racial purity, right? Because as you mentioned, you know, like I was talking about in my Stoa talk, it is a kind of materialism about genes and genetic essentialism to imagine that there's anything like a pure race, particularly whiteness. I mean, as if Europeans were getting along before America was founded, before the United States was founded. I mean, many languages are spoken on the European continent, last I checked, and many different national identities have been battling with one another for cultural supremacy. And so whiteness is a particularly fragile construct in order, if you're seeking a solid, essential, eternal foundation for your identity. But, you know, this goes for all of these racial constructs. Yes, it's not meaningless to talk about the unique shared experience of a particular group of human beings. And sometimes they share a skin color, sometimes they just share ideas. And yeah, there's like something like a group soul that can bind communities of individuals together. So this isn't to deny that, right? That would just be this base form of liberalism that says all that there are individuals, and there is no society, there is no race, really. We're all just individuals, and we're born blank slates, and we can be programmed to have whatever culture happens to be present at that historical moment. That's the liberal construct of the human, and I don't think that's true. So it's not that there isn't, biological inheritance of some kind. It's not that there isn't cultural difference that makes group experience, the experience of certain groups, unique and valuable because of that uniqueness. But it's just that these are all open-ended historical processes, and new forms of group identity are constantly emerging. Old forms of group identity are constantly atrophying, and new hybridizations are always occurring. You know, at this point in human history, there is not any people or race or culture that is pure. We're all composites. We've all been learning and inheriting and stealing and giving to one another for tens of thousands of years. And we really need to grow out of this adolescent sense of, needing to concoct some fantastical notion of abstract identity, because that's not real. It's just not real. It's a psychological defense mechanism. And so, in this sense, we're in a mental health crisis. And the reason that people like Jordan Peterson, or before him, Joseph Campbell, have such a tremendous cultural impact is because they're giving people a deeper sense of meaning again, and a sense of identity that is cosmic and that is spiritual, and not just political or social or biological or something in a reductionistic sense of biology. And so I think to avoid the slide into fascism while acknowledging the dearth of genuine sources of authentic identity today for human beings. I think we need, this is where I think ecology and a view of a re-enchanted view of the universe, of the story of the universe becomes important, because, and of the history of the earth. And that, I think people tend to, people love nature documentaries, right? They love charismatic megafauna, and like there are critiques of that, like we're so obsessed with the cute furry cuddly animals that we neglect the way that actually bacteria are also really important, and insects are also really important, even though we don't tend to love them as much. But I think at least people's innate love for other animals, mammals, is a gateway into a reconnection with the earth, and a recognition that we are primarily earthlings. We are earthlings first. All the other special forms of identity that we may carry, it's not that they aren't real and important to acknowledge and protect, but they're all derivative from, all these more special forms of identity are derivative from the earth process. And the earth process can be disturbed by our neglect of the ways in which we belong to it, the ways in which everything that we eat and all the energy that we harness produces an effect, is excreted as waste. And we haven't been paying attention to this for several centuries, and really for our entire history. There have been, I think, indigenous ways of being in relationship to the more than human world that were more in balance. But at the same time, every continent that human beings migrated to as they left Africa experienced a mass extinction of large mammals. So we can't romanticize the indigenous understanding of the limitations, the ecological limitations of human existence on this planet. And so now I think we do have a new capacity, which is science. And in so many ways, science has been bought and co-opted by capitalism, but we still have the capacity to understand the network of relationships that makes this planetary process possible to a level of detail and richness that we've never had before. And I think that makes us more sensitive to the ways in which we are participants in a much larger community, right? An earth community. And so I think recognizing our role in that earth community might be a source of more of healthier identity and more life-enhancing identity than any of these limited, narrow, racial or national forms of identity. Which isn't to say that those can all just be thrown away as if they're totally, that as if they don't have any historical force. Like, we need to start from where we are, but recognize our embeddedness in and our growth out of this larger community of life.
Yeah, well said, Matt. There's a lot to unpack here, and I think to start, I really appreciate that last point that you're making about Earth identity or Earth community. I think some of the difficulty we're experiencing right now is enabling that shared sense of world, as Bruno Latour talks about. We lack a shared sense of the Earth community. And I'm not sure, I mean, this is kind of a media crisis as well, right? That we're not able to address the planetary climate crisis in a way that we can even agree upon the material reality of the climate crisis in terms of the destructions of ecosystems, changing climate patterns, etc. So I wonder how we kind of navigate this sort of collapse of not only an epistemology in terms of what we know, but also the sense of a shared world where we can have a crisis like the pandemic, or we can have a crisis like what's happening in California and the West Coast with the fires, and still through mediation of these digital networks and these ideologies completely frame it in a different way. We have a sense that this is related to the climate crisis, but then it's also flipped around and then perceived as some kind of liberal mismanagement of forestry, and there is no climate crisis. There's a kind of breakdown of that shared space of communication and shared world, which I think is one of our biggest challenges, I think, in terms of navigating to that shared sense of community. I'll pause there before I go into the rest of it, because Ryan's AFK for a moment, and I want him to hear my answer as well with the other question. But I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. How do we, before we can have that shared community, how do we actually just have a shared basis of communication again?
I don't think it's that hard, really. I mean, there used to be legislation in place. I think it was like the Fairness Doctrine, that prevented for-profit corporate news networks from presenting entertainment as if it were news. And that doctrine was, that law was changed, and it opened the doors to a form of infotainment for people before social media in the 90s. And our country's never been the same since. We've become increasingly polarized. We don't any longer have a source of journalistic objectivity. And it's not as though the objectivity of journalism before the Fairness Doctrine was taken away was somehow unobjectionable, and that it truly presented the what was actually going on in our foreign wars, or what, the secretive intelligence agencies were actually doing all around the world. I mean, Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent looked at the whole history of journalism in America back to the 19th century, and clearly there have always been problems, but it got so much worse in the sense of a polarization and a breakdown of our ability as participants in civic society to even share the same facts. Scientific facts, even, much less political facts, about who said what when. Like, Trump can say one thing one day and the next day deny it, and his supporters will say, he never said that. They can be shown the video and say, I don't even know how they process this. But so I think the government has a role in, the government shouldn't be in charge of journalism, obviously. But there are ways to make sure that the private interests of the owners of certain journalistic enterprises cannot so obscure the difference between facts and values. Not that these two are ever separate, but there's an extreme to which we've gone, I think, that has prevented us from governing ourselves effectively, because the two major parties literally don't even live in the same universes, and then the rest of us who don't buy into the corporate duopoly are living in half a dozen or a dozen other universes. And pluralism's good, but we need to be able to share. Science is supposed to be a universal language, or the closest thing we could have. It's not that objectivity isn't fragile, and that it doesn't, as Latour would point out, it doesn't need to be a scientific fact. An objective fact needs to be painstakingly assembled and composed and maintained with institutional power, with the power of knowledge, and the experts that wield that knowledge, and the funding, and the laboratories, and all of these things that go into making a scientific fact that are not simply themselves objective. So objective facts need to be made, but they can be made well and they can be made poorly. And we're in a situation now where we don't really have the media ecology to help the American public distinguish between a well-composed fact and a poorly composed fact. The facts of the Heritage Foundation about climate change are sitting on the same shelf at the same level as the facts of the worldwide network of climatologists, with all of their instruments in the oceans and on land and in space, right? And the complex modeling that they're able to create with all of those instruments. Somehow the media portrays Heritage Foundation spokesperson, because it's this conservative think tank that spends millions and millions of dollars muddying the waters on climate science. One of their spokespeople, maybe they're like a dentist or something, like, I'm a scientist. They get to go up against thousands and thousands of climate scientists, as if the facts were equally worth our consideration and time. And so I think social media is a problem, but the cable news is also a problem. And you'll notice nowadays the cable news, all they really pay attention to is like what happens on Twitter. And so it's like Twitter is the new, not just Twitter, social media in general, or this new information ecology that has subsumed cable news, but cable news is still reaching the majority of the people, the older people who vote. And so because of this demographic imbalance, that older people tend to participate more in our current political electoral process than the younger people who are on social media, even though it seems like social media is breaking people more and more away from the corporate duopoly. The people who end up going out to the polls and voting are still, their understanding is shaped by Fox News and MSNBC. But it's so much more complicated than I can even begin to understand or articulate, this new media ecology that we're in. But I think we're in desperate need of new forums for communication. And I can't pretend to know what they look like. I mean, it looks something like this, I think, and also having smaller group conversations with like-minded people who, maybe that happens in person, maybe it happens virtually in video conference spaces like this, but we need to be rhizomatic and distributed in our sense of what it means to assemble collectively. It might not look like the public square gathering. It might look more like seemingly more invisible in these digital spaces, especially when we're in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah, well said. I'm in agreement with you that I think that the subtext, the beginnings of a solution might be simply in cultivating media ecology literacy, just being aware of how these environments and these media platforms are shaping our ability to experience a shared world. I almost have a sense, and I'm kind of influenced by my colleague Brent Stickley, who's he's an integralist, a perspectival thinker, very into Gebser, but his whole point about acupuncture points, right? And you mentioned the fairness law in terms of just both sides argument being legitimized in policy. So we can even think about particular laws that are enacted historically that change that media landscape and enable certain practices to begin to take root that are unhealthy for that kind of shared world. So it seems like no matter what we're looking at, there's a demand or need to cultivate media literacy, but extending that media literacy not just to cable versus Twitter, but also governmental and institutional media ecologies and how they help to propagate and contain these media ecologies in a healthy way. One of the things I wanted to mention too, in terms of Ryan's question about like what does this look like going forward, or the alternatives, I think part of the challenges that, let's say, the integral left or leftists or international socialism is facing is really embracing the critiques of liberalism in a way that is constructive and regenerative, rather than just pushing off and saying, okay, nothing Dugin is saying is worth looking at. We're not saying he's correct even about his critiques, but his critiques might be coming from a place that we need to address, something that's lacking. And such as, Vervaeke talks about the meaning crisis and so on. But I think, the left really has to try to embrace, or international socialism, if we don't want to call it the left, I mean, it is what it is, but the left has to embrace meaning making. And we talked with Thomas Bjorkman about this, the concept of a deliberately developmental society with Bildung and the history of that in the Nordic countries, I think is a very good model to kind of reflect on. And recently, Jacobin had a good interview with Sam Gindin talking about something very similar, when he was saying that, the left has to have a vision of society that wants to engage and develop everyone's full capacities universally, right? And this is something that is done in mutuality, that to have that individualistic freedom, we need, again, these sort of media ecological containers, whether it's a nation, whether it's our communication devices, whatever we want to put it, support nets in terms of socialistic institutions, anything that helps us propagate our potential. And so, part of what I think that the answer might be is to lean into meaning making, lean into self actualization, and translate this somehow into both policy and also philosophy, right? Like, we need folks on the left who are doing what you're saying, like doing what Dugin is doing in terms of, let's critique liberalism, but let's one up it actually and offer this in a way that's not just a retreat from modernity. And I think that retreat from modernity is more of a sign of this kind of sort of our integral language, this collapse of the perspectival world. It's nationalism decomposing itself. It's an attempt to escape into increasingly atomized, totalizing identities. We've gone from this sort of grandiose totalization of modernity now into these hyper fragmented micro modernities of, well, let's retreat to this particular ethnic ethno state, in the middle of Europe somewhere, and you retreat to yours. It's a kind of an imagined fantasy past. It's another kind of vanishing point and horizon of the perspective of world, but now going back. But I think the idea here is we can't go forward the way we have. We can't go backward. They both are sort of mirages in the desert of modernity. We need some other side reel movement. And I think it's more along these sort of lines where we're creatively remixing some of these visions for a better world, and not being afraid of that trouble of well, modernity has given us these wonderful liberating capacities. It's also given us some horribly dissociating and colonizing, disasters. So how do we find a way through that? And I think the problem with this is we need time and we need the space to experiment, right? To experiment with some of these regenerative visions. But I certainly think that you had a very interesting one in your Stoa talk, particularly when you were mentioning that this really stuck with me when you were talking about, you didn't say human potential, but you said particularly when it comes to the United States and its emphasis on the individual, that we and the world internationally, right? Every people, this, I'm quoting you, every people has something to contribute to the realization of this future human, right? This future human that we have not yet realized, and to see these as sort of creative projects that we're contributing to uniquely and together. And I just thought that was really great. So.
Yeah, thanks. It's an ideal that plenty of sages and philosophers have upheld. Emerson writes beautifully about this vision of the human being as a planetary being, and that all of the, while he didn't necessarily have, especially earlier in his life, a sense of all of the races as equal. I mean, he was a mild racist, as Cornel West puts it, but he did have a sense that the human being was not white or black or Asian, or the human being was somehow, for Emerson, the reality of the world as he saw it in his day was that the human being was fragmented, wasted, lying in heaps, and still struggling for this sense of greater unity, not only humans among themselves, but with the rest of the earth and the sky. And he saw us really as embedded in this larger cosmic being or oversoul, but that the human, again, the human as a whole, not broken up into some narrow racial fragment of itself, but the human being as a whole had a special, really crucial role to play in this larger drama of earth and sky, and in the life of the world soul. That the human is the microcosm, and until the human wakes up to its place at the center of things, then things themselves would lie broken and in heaps. And so there's a real sense of urgency for this American transcendentalist, or it's American romanticism, right? That Emerson was articulating in the mid 1800s, and we're still, I think he's a great source of inspiration for me, and I think hopefully will play a role in any future rebirth of American democracy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm not well studied in the American transcendentalist tradition, but it's something I definitely need to look into more. You know, the three of us know about the Reconstitution project, and then you had mentioned kind of a reconstitution in your Stoa talk, and I thought about it as a kind of almost like an American panarchy. You know, it's like we can have a centralized reconstitutional event that decentralizes America further. And I really like the gentleman's question who asked you about, like, you know, which fork in the road do we choose? Do we try to retain a sense of American pride or shared sense of American national identity, or do we go to more of this decentralized community network, hyper local kind of a future? And you kind of had a both and answer, which I thought was really brilliant and really creative, and really thought about, you know, made me think about how to envision an America like that, where we can still carry some essence or spark of the American soul or spirit of America in its founding. So it's not like a complete fragmentation or destruction of America, but it's a rebirth of America in a way that's truly compatible with, you know, 21st century living and being. And so I'm curious about, on a philosophical and ontological level, right, what should be the ontological foundations in your view that could be a replacement of the individualistically oriented classical liberal modernist tradition, maybe an ontology that can lend more naturally towards a kind of post-human entanglement with nature to really valorize the ecological and allow us to live well in the Anthropocene. Like, do you have any thoughts on like what that could be like?
Yeah, I mean, I talk a great deal about process relational philosophy, coming out of thinkers like Whitehead, but Whitehead was building on the American philosopher, and he's often called the first American psychologist, William James, and his understanding of pluralism and of a world of pure experience, and really a whole ethos for James of embracing diversity, embracing divergence from the norm as a source of evolutionary growth. You know, James was one of the earliest thinkers to try to integrate the best of the history of Western philosophy with the newly emergent, in his day, evolutionary understanding of the human psyche as in some way or another emergent from this process of biological evolution and indeed cosmological evolution. And, you know, there's this process relational and pluralistic ontology is not one wherein individuals are unreal. Pluralism implies the value of individuality. But what is an individual? In a process relational ontology, an individual is a collective achievement. It's the achievement of a community aiming at some, in Whitehead's terms, a concrescence, a growing together of the many into the one, which itself then becomes a gift back to the many, so that further concrescences or processes of growth toward individuality can continue. And so, you know, it's a dialectical move. It's an integral move, even, I would say, where individuals are not separate, isolated, static atoms. They are bound up in relationships and networks of feeling. And it is, I think it's no secret that in order to, in the political realm of human agents, in order to foster the growth of free, responsible, virtuous individuals, you need a certain culture. You need a certain familial and social and community context that values the growth of individuals. You need a political economy that provides food, shelter, education, healthcare as a matter of course. As that to become a human being, you need these things just as much as you need the love of a mother and the love of a father and the love of a whole community. Really, I don't want to just say it's about the nuclear family. We need more than that. Children need to be raised in a context of having multiple free, responsible, virtuous adults as models so that they can become free, responsible, virtuous adults. They need to be you know, everything from diet and exercise to education and access to medical care when and if they need it. Like, these are just basics. If you want a society of free individuals, these are the basic ingredients. You know, otherwise you're not going to have individuals. You're going to have dependency. You're going to have destitution. You're going to have ignorance. You're going to have lost people. You're going to have mental illness. You're going to have, you know, that you're going to have the situation we find ourselves in today, where there's very little, certainly very little literacy in general, very little media ecology literacy, very little political literacy, really. You know, when I do cold calls for, when I did cold calls for the Bernie Sanders campaign to people in rural West Virginia or wherever, like, they don't even, like, oh, there's an election, you know? So like, these people are so alienated from, by design, the system that is oppressing them, that, you know, we don't even have a basic sense of the conditions that are necessary to live in a free society, right? Of responsible individuals. And so I think a process relational ontology, where we recognize the interconnections of things and the way that individuality is a social achievement ultimately, and that to be an individual is never it's never final. It's not like, you know, we as human beings are processes. We're born and we age and we die. And so somehow, if our sense of what it means to be an individual is limited merely by some sense of static identity, as if I am just this skin encapsulated ego, then we're not going to be able to fully participate in a healthy, self-governing society that values freedom and justice. We need to have a greater sense of what individuality is as participation in this larger collective effort to reproduce and deepen what it even means to be an individual over the course of history. And so we're not just body-bound egos when we're talking about what it means to be an individual in the genuine, like, Emersonian sense of being self-reliant, but self-reliant so that we can be reliable to others, you know? And so that we need a deeper sense of individual identity that transcends just this particular incarnation, which is why maybe some people felt it was kind of a random insertion from the metaphysical domain when I talked about reincarnation all of a sudden in my Stoa talk. But no, I think that's actually really relevant as an important corrective and addition and elaboration upon the American ideal of individuality. Like, yes, we are individuals, but the type of individuality that I think we should hold sacred is the type that allows us to at least be open to the possibility that it's more than just our egos, and that we continue to participate in this historical project even after this body dies. Like, we're still here at that deeper level, and that individuality has to tap into that deeper level to avoid being just the shallow, egomaniacal, greedy, you know, shadow of American identity that Trump represents so well.
Yeah, there's many ways in which I think the Trump identity that you're talking about, the shallowness of it, is a sort of caricature of the true depth of what it means to be an individual, as you're saying. And some of the comments we're getting, I think, are on the YouTube stream are very good and very constructive. One of them is asking about, what's the best way to promote civic education? And they're also talking about just child rearing and education and educational environments. And I'm thinking about so much of what you're saying in terms of really understanding that the individual is a social thing, right? Like, our freedom to self-realize is something that is done in mutual aid. That fundamental process-oriented, relational-oriented understanding of the self is something that I think is formative, right? Like, it's something that we need to kind of grow up understanding in terms of coming into our own being in the world and engaging in culture, engaging in civic society. And right now, of course, I don't think that really exists in education or really any of our institutions in this kind of ecological sense that you're envisioning here. So I guess the question is, what role does education play in this, and the construction of community in terms of the American identity, in terms of what we might be able to do here in the great American experiment?
I know you guys recently had Zach Stein on, and he just published a book that addresses this question better than I could, and I enjoyed reading that text. But public education, the public education system that really took hold in this country post Civil War, and that was, I think, really born in Prussia and Germany, and it's absolutely essential to democracy if we are to have a democracy. On the other hand, the way that the public education system has unfolded, it's almost a caricature of itself now with Betsy DeVos at the helm, whose whole MO as the head of that agency, the Department of Education, is to undermine public education and to get the parents with means to pull their kids out and go to private religious schools. And I think that is a very dangerous temptation, but it's not that I think the public school system as it exists now is worth much. First of all, there are great inequities. Some schools are glorified prisons, and other schools have the funding to actually do some teaching. But the notion of standardized testing as the way that we measure success is so far gone and so misguided that we really need to reimagine education as more than just job preparation for the jobs that already exist. At least education is the place in a human society where schools are the place where we imagine the future, and children have a role to play in imagining the future. Obviously teaching children how to participate in the instruments of culture fully is essential. And so some of that is learning to read and write when the time is right, learning the traditions, literary, philosophical, political, etc. But also having a different attitude toward the child, not as a blank slate on to which information can be written, but as themselves a seed with its own telos, its own daemon, and that each child has something unique to contribute, because again, reincarnation, right? It's not like these are not blank slates. These are not empty hard drives waiting for downloads from their screens. These are organic spiritual entities, and they grow into this world with virtues that are gifts to our human societies and to our endeavor to live on this planet. And we need to help them realize those gifts instead of programming them to fit into some corporate job. And this is a profound shift in value. And I think, Zach Stein agrees with this, that education needs to be the center of our entire civilizational enterprise. What is the meaning of human life? Well, it is to learn and learn more, and to grow as a result of that knowledge. What else are we supposed to be doing here? There's this narrow, it's not even narrow, it's not this nihilistic philosophy of just get mine and accumulate as much as I can before I die, and maybe I can leave some to my kids. But is that really the best we can do for the driving value behind our whole civilizational enterprise? So I think people are hungry for this. And I think if we could divert just, 50% of our defense budget to education, and education not as an attempt to force children to meet some standard, but rather something more along the lines of what Montessori schools and Waldorf schools and other child-centered forms of education what they do. I think within a generation, this is a great source of hope for me. If we revitalize the educational sector within a generation, we can renew the whole human species. We can get over all of these sectarian ideological divisions, because kids aren't born with those. They're born with wider virtues. And so I have a lot of hope when I think about what's possible if only we would reimagine and value education more highly.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And to me, it kind of brings up the question about, well, if you compare to, in the American tradition, we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I'm wondering, what is happiness? Is happiness the right word or concept? Can we have something deeper? Can we have something more profound? Something that goes a little bit more depth into what is this wisdom or virtue or character that we're trying to really cultivate? And someone like Thomas Bjorkman has his Bildung idea that I really am inspired by. Zach Stein talks about the paideia. It's kind of a foundation of civilization, this lifelong process of education, learning, and growth outside of a formal school context, right? So, like, do you have thoughts on just, like ancient philosophy, right? Aristotle, I think, talked about the telos, or of the polity, which is cultivating virtue in its citizenry, right? So how can we kind of rethink the happiness part as a kind of, maybe the drawbacks is it leads to a kind of materialism or shallow utilitarianism, and what can be a more substantive replacement in this kind of, integral planetized age that we're living in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm thinking initially of the Peterson-Zizek debate on happiness. That was the proposed framing of the debate. I mean, they talked about a whole bunch of other stuff, but neither one of them was really that into the idea of happiness as the highest ideal. Both of them are a bit too melancholic in their constitution to buy into that, and I am too, actually. But what do we mean by happiness, though? I don't think it's easy to, in our current consumerist culture, only be able to imagine pleasure as like the meaning of happiness, like or ease or relaxation, recreation, but I think happiness can have a deeper meaning. I have nothing against pleasure. I mean, I'm not exactly an Epicurean in my value system, but I don't have anything against pleasure. I think it's great. But happiness is this deeper sense, I think, that might harken back to what Aristotle referred to, and you were getting at that a little bit. Aristotle had this beautiful Greek term, eudaimonia, good spiritedness would be a more literal translation, and it's a kind of equipoise and virtue and peace that I think might be closer to a kind of telos for our polity, as something that we could really strive for. And so if we were to rewrite the Constitution now, maybe we wouldn't use the word happiness. Maybe we would use the term spiritual fulfillment, or if that's too grandiose, maybe life, liberty, and virtuous existence, or something that gets more to the root of the human condition and doesn't feel one-sidedly like self-helpy or something.
So we do have a couple more questions coming from the chat. Armando is asking, I don't know if you want to get into the deep theory here. Is there an affinity between Marxist critique and reification and the process relational framework?
Oh, yeah. There's a great Whiteheadian Marxist named Anne Pomeroy. Anne Pomeroy, yeah. I'm missing her middle name, but she wrote a book on Marx and Whitehead where she compares Marx's understanding of production and dialectics and Whitehead's understanding of process and creativity. And she makes all sorts of connections, including, between Whitehead's understanding of misplaced concreteness and Marx's understanding of reification. And what she ends up doing is and I try to build on this in some of my work on Marx and Whitehead, is Whitehead wasn't sufficiently focused on political economy, and so she brings Marx to expand that dimension of Whitehead, though it's there in Whitehead, at least in germ. A few stray comments here and there, critical of capitalism. But she also critiques Marx from a Whiteheadian perspective by trying to ground process and creativity in an ontological level that's deeper than just the human. Marx was a bit too humanist, and Whitehead is radically decentering his philosophy, radically decenters the human, while still allowing us to value our uniqueness as a species. We're just another example of the creative advance of nature realizing truth and beauty and goodness. We're a rather pronounced example of it on this planet, but from Whitehead's point of view, there are almost certainly other examples. I mean, there are other examples of the realization of value beyond just the human. And Marx didn't always, he had a dialectical understanding of the human being's relationship to the natural world. Engels was even better at this, writing on the dialectics of nature, and taught Marx a lot about it. But Whitehead allows us to see that, even the work of the bee in the beehive is productive of value, not just the human laborer, and so I think Whitehead pushes Marx in the right direction in just the same way that Marx pushes Whitehead in the right direction.
Excellent. Let's see if we got any more questions here. We're coming up at the 90-minute mark, so we got a couple more minutes. Let's see.
Well, I can ask Matt Hudkin
sure.
question that he wanted me to ask you because he couldn't be here today.
Right.
So we've had some debates on this show and gone back and forth about the role of developmental theories, like in Wilberian integral, which obviously is a huge centerpiece of his, articulation of integral theory. And then we've debated about how much we should center development. So we're just curious, what are your thoughts on developmental theory? Is that something we should take seriously? Is that something that's, that's kind of more off to the side in your view in terms of how we look at things and analyze things?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I struggle with it too. I have debates within myself about it frequently. It's obviously important, and there's a lot of evidence that there is some sort of development that takes place, certainly for individuals. We move through stages of psychosocial, moral, cognitive development. That's just a fact. And I think, while it's more controversial, there's also evidence of an evolution of consciousness and culture over the course of history. And it's just really difficult to know how to frame and discuss it in a way that is productive, I guess, because it can very easily become a game of one-upmanship. I'm higher up on the evolutionary hierarchy than you, and so I get to treat you like you think I'm acting like an asshole, but really it's for your own good. I'm just trying to give you some tough love so that you can finally reach my level of cognitive development or whatever. And I think there's just so many examples of that happening all up and down the integral community from top to bottom. And that's just embarrassing. And there are a lot of ways that I've seen how certain racist supremacism can masquerade as a kind of integral developmental theory, that we're too quick to make assumptions about which cultures are at what level, and there's a lot of self-serving interpretation that can go on. But at the same time, despite all these difficulties, I do think that Gebser's my go-to here, because his research is so intercultural, transcultural, planetary in scope, and the broad outlines of a movement from magic to mythic to mental. It's like, okay, yes, you can see this happening, and not just in one particular cultural stream. And it I think becomes more difficult from a Gebserian point of view to say this is integral or that's integral or that's not integral, because we're still in that deficient mental phase right now. And yeah, there are these seedlings popping up, but it's clearly a moment of great breakdown and chaos, and the new cultural attractor has not yet fully manifested. And so I think from a Gebserian point of view, it becomes way harder to claim any capturing of the integral flag, if you will.
Yeah, well said. I'm in agreement with you, Matt. I debate myself about it as well, because clearly there's with a broad brush, we can talk about unfoldment, we can talk about increasing dimensionality in these structures, and then at the same time, I think Gebser's model is pliable enough to also acknowledge that these expressions of consciousness are all co-present, they're interrelated, they come to dominance and then go back into latency. There's almost an organismic quality, and I know he probably would shy away from that, but I think in a contemporary sense of what we know about, let's say, examples like neuroplasticity and in biology, the fold is a very interesting kind of concept in terms of complexity. It's hard to have a stage-centric model with Gebser. At the same time, maybe, and this is where the jury might still be out, like that leap into integrality, to have fully gone into an experience of distantiation and dissociation from nature and rhythmic time and other forms of being in the world, and to come back to that with some of the gains of modernity and the project of secular buffering of the self that Charles Taylor talks about, to come back from that without losing those achievements. Maybe we could call that development eventually and say, well, the whole human being's really like fleshed out now, right? Like we've fragmented ourselves and now we've come back together. I almost take the Walter Benjamin approach here about history and progress, right? Like until that messianic moment, that leap, right, where there is a redemption, we can't really talk about progress. We can't really talk about history moving forward in that sense that we like to talk about. So I hold out for that moment, right? And the jury's still out in terms of our capacity to actualize this integral consciousness. But I appreciated your commentary on that.
Yeah, and I do find spiral dynamics really helpful. I just want to say, like, thinking through, like, especially this nexus of like blue, orange, and green V memes or value memes, it helps to make sense of the chaos unfolding in our social and political arenas right now. And but that said, it's as soon as you bring yellow into it, it's like, or teal or anything second tier, it's like a lot of people claiming to be integral who are really viciously critiquing green in all of its manifestations. They say, well, you sound pretty orange to me, so I'm not sure why. So it kind of gets muddy for me once you go to the second tier, right? So but for what it's worth, I find the whole spiral dynamics framework to be a helpful heuristic.
Certainly, yeah. I think what I've been saying to integralists is that it's a very helpful heuristic for thinking about the challenges in modernity and the tensions and dialectics of our current landscape. Less helpful maybe about understanding the pre-modern past or the integral future, but certainly a good lay of the land of ourselves, right? A good kind of reflection of our own dynamics in the present.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So Ryan, you got any concluding questions, or should we call it a day here?
I think that was fantastic. I'll just chime in. My last comment on development is, I do find a lot of personal use and value of thinking developmentally, but with the stipulation or asterisks, right? That with the caveat that it has to be reserved for the right things. And I think it can be dangerous or unhelpful to have such orienting generalizations mapped onto entire cultures and civilizations and peoples and groups. Like even if you join like a green community, the individual developmental diversity within that is very wide ranging, right? There are people who are, you know, for whatever reason, not developed very much in terms of the complexity of their thinking. And there are people who I would say, even though most of the memetic code that they're running is green or whatever, they're probably more developed than me in a lot of ways on a personal and psychological level, even though I'm ostensibly running a higher level operating system with integral theory and so forth. So we have to be really nuanced and careful and make sure it doesn't become this kind of Procrustean bed that we're just superimposing onto reality and to people and objectifying them. But in terms of the complexity and subtlety of just working with individuals and in conflict coaching and mediation, development is always kind of in the back of my mind. I have to you know, customize my communication with them in a way that meets them on their own terms, both in terms of the values and identities that they hold, and also just at a level of complexity that they can understand, right? So it's very, I struggle with it too, and I'll just also say that I think that development, when overused, when we hyperfixate on it, it just to me becomes very boring. It's like, well, we're not really gaining any novel insights into what's happening now in the culture collective, and it may even block our ability to think outside of the box of development to get some real unique insight into this unprecedented time. We don't want to just take this unprecedented moment and squeeze it into our pre-established heuristics, right? So that's kind of my 2 cents. But yeah, Matt, thank you so much for coming back on. It was wonderful to chat with you about all these things. And yeah, best of luck to you for the rest of your road trip.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys, for inviting me on. Always happy to talk about these things with y'all and to contribute to the wonderful content that you guys have been throwing into the media ecology. So keep it up, and I'll be watching. And yeah, I'll be back in California midweek and probably have some more reflections and stories to share about the episodes that have characterized this journey. So yeah,
Awesome.
thanks.